and welcome to Catz Chats. Today we will be talking about the Biosecurity Research Initiative at St. Catharine's, which is kindly sponsored by David and Claudia Harding Foundation. I'm joined by Lord Brown, Professor Bill Sutherland, and Dr. David Aldridge. My name is Deborah Loveluck, and I do hope you're enjoying our series of Catz Chats. So now I'm delighted to hand over to Lord Brown. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Deborah. Thanks for your words of introduction, and thanks to you and the comms team for your help in arranging this. The Catz Chats are an exciting innovation in communication with our community. I've logged into both of them so far and I've enjoyed them immensely, and this is a privilege to be invited to contribute to one. For about the past quarter century, I've been a professional politician, and at various times I've held ministerial office. When I was the Secretary of State for Defence, Sir Mark, who was my chief scientific advisor and was a terrific support, and I had many long conversations about challenges. And as my career has developed, I've formed a strong personal relationship both with the Master Sir Mark and with Martin Rees. The link between science and technology and good public policy dominates the public discourse presently. And that wasn't always the case, but both Sir Mark and Martin shared my desire to improve the quality of public policy decisions in the science and technology field. And often over the last 15 years or so now, we've had many conversations on how best to do that. It would be tedious and boring, I think, for most of you to go into that process, but suffice it to say that it's led me to be here at the University of Cambridge, honoured to be a fellow commoner at St. Catharine's and working on an initiative which is designed to demonstrate that it can be done if officials, politicians and ministers on the one hand, scientists, engineers and technical experts, including the best academics on the other, can work more closely together. Initially convinced that the US model of the JASON, which was established in 1960 and is an independent group of elite scientists who work closely with the US government to advise them on issues of science and technology, was the answer and would provide genuinely independent expert advice. Together, Martin and I set out to develop that model here and to find the resource so to do. So happily, we found in the Harding Foundation, which has strong connections to St. Catharine's, a source of philanthropy that was willing to support us to test our theory and to put it into practice. Consequently, we now have a unique initiative here at St. Catz, BioRISC. The BioRISC initiative uses an innovative combination of research methods to generate, collate and assess evidence across the different domains of biosecurity. Its core methods include horizon scanning, expert elicitation, fault tree analysis, and interactive evidence synthesis, a novel method that we're developing using dynamic meta-analysis. Entirely coincidentally, almost exactly 1 year before we launched BioRISC, in July of 2018, the government published the UK Biological Security Strategy. So I can tell you, governments don't publish national strategies for risks unless those risks are serious. And long before the coronavirus pandemic, our government had elevated the risk of a pandemic to the first tier of risks in the national assessment. And you might think from the title of this government document, they had a strategy, a plan to prevent it, or if it came about, to deal with it. So retrospective analysis of our experience with COVID-19 will show whether that was true, but I can guess what you're all thinking. In July of 2019, when we formally launched BioRISC, deliberately on the first anniversary of the publication of this strategy, my own researchers in Hansard had revealed that there had been no debate, few if any questions, and not one ministerial utterance on that strategy following its publication over that year. So you can draw your own conclusions, but it convinced us that in launching BioRISC, we were helping to fill a gap and creating an opportunity for a conversation between the policy side on the one hand and the science and technology side on the other, about the steps that needed to be taken to deliver the plan set out in the strategy for preventing or at least mitigating the manifestation of a biological risk. In the short time since our inception, we've had significant engagement with the policy community and increasingly are becoming partners of choice for some of them. The realisation that developments in science and technology are driving significant challenges for public policy and that the machinery for public policy is far too slow to respond to the pace of these changes is becoming apparent in many fields, not just in the biosphere. The necessity for key decision makers to have access to the best advice from sources independent from those who have a specific interest, quite often an economic interest, in shaping that policy, and the capacity to make discerning decisions about what advice to accept is becoming more and more apparent. What we have learned is that this can only be addressed if the experts from both sides of the equation spend more time with each other, learn to understand enough about each other's fields, to have a dialogue of the hearing and not one of the deaf, and sufficient understanding to be able to guide each other to workable and in some cases ethical conclusions. So my conviction is that this can only be done if we spend more time with each other. BioRISC is a small example of doing that and where it can grow. Here at St Catharine's, we are not alone in identifying this, but we are slightly ahead of the curve. We should seize this leadership role and build from it, but perhaps more of that later. Meantime, I'm going to hand you over to the academic leadership of this project, Professor Bill Sutherland, who will be well known to all of you as a Fellow of the College. Bill.
Thank you, Des. As Des said, BioRISC was set up to explore different ways of working. We were concerned about the rather unsatisfactory linking of scientific research and policy and practice, and we sought to explore new approaches of bringing these two approaches together in more effective ways. We wanted different ways of linking science and policy. So BioRISC, it covers the wide range of biosecurity issues. We've thus worked on bioengineering, on bioterrorism, on emerging diseases, and on invasive species. And we run a wide range of exercises, bringing policymakers and academics working together, for example, to collectively identify future problems through the process of horizon scanning. What are the things that we're not thinking about that we should be thinking about? What are the research gaps? What are the questions that policymakers most want answered? How can we set the agendas for future work? How can we summarize the evidence in a manner that means that policymakers can best apply it to their specific questions? So we had a clear program of work, but then COVID emerged and threw everything up in the air. Pandemics is one of our areas of biosecurity interest. So we at BioRISC swung into action and we ran a number of activities. But I'd like to describe two main projects. They are, how do you deal with COVID-19 and how do you reduce the risk of future pandemics? And in each case, our objective was to identify the range of possible solutions for dealing with the problems. This is a process that we called solution scanning. And we've shown that this is a serious problem. Our research has shown that policymakers are usually only aware of a subset of the possible options, 57% in terms of one of our studies. So not knowing all the possibilities is like, it's like wearing blinkers. You can only see a subset of the things you could do. Once you have a much more complete list, you can then start thinking about the feasibility of each, how likely it is to work, what evidence there is, and so on. And we believe this is the starting point for creating any policy. So firstly, let's look at COVID. We wanted to see how could we reduce transmission? And of course, this is likely to work alongside isolation and test, track and tracing and the eventual creation of vaccines. But the thing we focused on is how can we reduce the transmission rate? And this work was deeply collaborative. We worked with our close collaborators in the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk and the Cambridge Conservation Initiative, and we brought together a team from across the globe, including people in Eastern Asia, where there's a lot more experience of dealing with many of these diseases, but including doctors, including Stefan Marciniak from Catz, I'm sure most of you know, public health experts, epidemiologists, people from business, etc., to identify a list of possible options and create a process for planning how we can reduce this risk. So how does this work? Consider, for example, how you might limit the number of people using a shared space, such as a canteen, at any one time. It's easy to think of some options, but I bet you don't get anywhere close to the 18 options we identified, almost all of which have been applied somewhere in the world. So if you face that problem, why don't you start by knowing what the wide range of options are, and then use that as a basis for your decision making. We also created a decision making app to make this easier to apply. We provided this list online and then encouraged the community to come up with further options. And in doing so, we came up with another 20 or so. And this was hugely successful. Our work was covered by almost all the main newspapers, by TV, radio. There's over 300 articles produced. A wide range of businesses and organizations said they'd used it. Patrick Vallance, the UK chief scientist, asked for a copy. The chief scientific advisor to the Irish government emailed to say how useful it was and how it had underpinned their work, and it sent it to the other European chief scientists. So that seemed to be a success. And following the success of that, we then considered the issue of how can we reduce the risk of future pandemics. Pandemics are pretty common. 70% of emerging diseases are zoonosis from animal origin. One estimate is there's 1.7 million undiscovered viruses. There's half a dozen new diseases affecting humans every year. And you can think of a wide range of them that have had big impacts. HIV, bird flu, SARS from palm civets, MERS, Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome from dromedaries, etc. So what we wanted to do, we were worried that many of the suggestions that are being produced were rather simplistic, and we needed a much more sophisticated analysis looking at the wide range of options. So again, we brought together a global team of 23 wildlife trade, farming, veterinarian, including Don Broom from this college, epidemiologists, animal disease researchers. And we identified 7 main routes. 3 of them we didn't count. We didn't look at escape from laboratories. We didn't look at antimicrobial resistance. We didn't look at bioterrorism. The ones we concentrated on were trade and consumption from wild animals, from food and pets, wildlife farming, like the civets we discussed, livestock farming, such as the dromedaries and bird flu and ducks, including international and long-distance trade, and increased human encroachment into wildlife animals. And for each, we listed the range of possible options for reducing the problem as a starting point for future planning. And again, the Science Media Centre really liked our work and ran a press conference. And again, it attracted global influence. And again, we think we're setting the agenda in terms of the things we could do. So this is just one element. We see this as a starting point. And then this leads on to our other work on identifying and summarizing the evidence, embedding within decision-making, and thinking about how you change policies. So I've described some of our work on the origins and spread of pathogens. This is similar to our work on the spread of invasive species, where David Aldridge, who's another Catz fellow, is a global expert. So tell us what you've been doing, David.
Okay, thank you very much, Bill. Well, a major and growing biosecurity issue of global importance is that of invasive non-native species. And these are organisms that are introduced into new locations by humans and which cause ecological, societal or economic harm. And examples you may be familiar with in the UK include things like Japanese knotweed, which can cause buildings to collapse. There's muntjac deer introduced from Asia, which can destroy woodland vegetation, and they eat all the plants in my garden. And then these are zebra mussels. These are some pests that I collected from a UK waterworks this week, and they're native to Eastern Europe, but they're currently spreading through the UK, and they attach to each other, as you can probably see here, with their beards or byssus threads, and they can block pipes. And one London waterworks has to remove about 1,000 tonnes of zebra mussels from a 5-kilometre long pipe every 5 years. And this has to be done with spades and wheelbarrows and costs the company £500,000 at this single site. And the impact of invasive species is not trivial. It's been calculated that the annual cost to the British economy is a whopping £1.7 billion, and that's probably an underestimate. So what can we at BioRISC do about this huge problem? Well, one of the great opportunities in BioRISC has been to engage with people working across different areas of the biosecurity challenge. People working on invasive species use different languages and different approaches from those working on pandemics or biological weapons or plant health, but we're actually addressing very similar issues and can learn a lot from talking to each other. In all forms of biological threats, the organisms go through a pathway of introduction and establishment. They have to get into a vector, they're transported and released alive into a new location, a self-sustaining population is established, and then they go on to spread and cause impacts. And at each stage of this pathway, we can intervene. And typically, the further down the pathway the biological threat has passed, the harder it is to control and the more expensive it becomes. At BioRISC, we've been working at all stages of this pathway. So the best way to stop an unwanted invader entering Britain is to prevent it from ever being introduced. And we're an island nation, which gives us an enviable opportunity for developing policy that can protect us from the introduction of unwanted biota. So BioRISC has contributed to the development of UK policy on invasive species by hosting the UK Parliament's Environmental Audit Committee of their review of invasive species. And the committee met at St Catharine's, which was the first time they've met outside London, and really demonstrates the convening power of the BioRISC project. And I was able to provide evidence as an expert witness at this meeting. The next stage in management is to identify what the next likely invaders will be, what impacts they might have, and how we might detect them. And this involves horizon scanning, which is a formal process where evidence is reviewed by an expert panel and consensus is reached on a priority list of species. And I have recently led the freshwater team on the latest horizon scan of the most unwanted future invaders into the UK. I've also led a similar process targeted at the UK water industry, where we've identified the highest impact invaders across the water industry's assets, and this has allowed for prioritisation of resources towards the most troublesome species. Now, once we have a priority list of future invaders, we can start to predict where they might establish in the UK, or anywhere. And we can do this formally by using species distribution models that use information about the habitats the species have already invaded across the world, and we map these then onto the UK. And these models repeatedly tell us that East Anglia is a major hotspot for future invasions, which is certainly keeping me busy. The final thing we can do as a pest moves along that introduction pathway is try to eradicate it, or at least slow its spread. Again, BioRISC has been playing an important part in this stage of the invasion process. What we have learnt is that all too often people try to manage invasive species without any understanding of the evidence for what does and doesn't work. This repeated reinvention of the wheel is expensive and it's ineffective. So we've been assembling a free-to-use and searchable database that provides a comprehensive overview of all the management tools available for invasive species. And by conducting systematic reviews of all the published and grey literature, we can allow managers to reach informed decisions on what approach is likely to be the most effective in a particular context. And our resource is now being adopted widely in both terrestrial and aquatic systems across the globe. Now, the UK is often held up as an exemplar to other countries of how effective biosecurity planning and management of invasive species can be developed and implemented. But how good are we really at doing this? Well, in 2014, we conducted a horizon scan of invasive species that we least wanted in Great Britain due to their potential impact on our biodiversity. Of the top 10 species we identified, we have now recorded 8 of them in the UK. So what does this tell us about our effectiveness? Well, it might show that we're really good at identifying future risks. However, it could also show that we're really dreadful at doing anything about invasive species when they arrive. And I'm afraid that my experience is starting to tell me that while we're fantastic at predicting what will come next, we are repeatedly failing to do anything about invaders once they're discovered. And I think part of the problem here is that agencies are unwilling to react to invaders until they start to cause a problem. And by that point, it's typically too late to do anything. For me, this represents one of the next challenges I would like to see BioRISC starting to address. And at that point, I'll hand back to you, Des.
So thank you so much to both of you for those short but stunning examples of just how important science and technology is to many aspects of our life. And I'm sure as those listening to you will appreciate, even those informative contributions raise more questions than they do answers. There's plenty for us to do in the future. So we're into the last third of this short chat. And it's time, I think, to pose some questions. So we canvassed these questions in advance. And I'm going to turn to you first, Bill. We've selected a question for you, which we're going to give you a very limited period of time to answer, but it is quite a difficult question. So it goes like this. Before the COVID-related reduction in overseas travel, if you can remember that far back, the illegal import and release of animals and plants from abroad appeared to be increasing, as was the smuggling of uninspected bushmeat. Is enough being done to publicise the disease risks incurred by such illegal activities?
Thank you. That's a very interesting question and a very important question. And I think the answer is no. And I think that although COVID has made us increasingly aware of it, illegal wildlife trade is one of the big threats and one of the major causes of pandemics, as we've seen with COVID-19, which almost certainly came from pangolins, although bats were also implicated in kind of rather complicated ways that we don't fully understand. So you can then say, is the solution just to publicize it and make people aware of that? And the evidence suggests that that doesn't actually work. We've been working with a psychologist to look at the illegal wildlife trade and saying, if you tell people about the problems of this, you make them more aware, you increase the education, will that reduce the problem? And the evidence suggests that that almost certainly isn't the case. We have to look for other solutions. And people talk about banning illegal wildlife trade, and there are occasions when that's almost certainly appropriate, but that is a bit of a simplistic answer. So pangolin trade was already banned. So, it's banned and it happened on quite a large scale. And if you ban something, you push it underground and it then becomes unregulated. And the question becomes, under what circumstances is it effective to ban something and try and stop it? And on what circumstances is it better to make it legal but regulated, and then you can monitor it and you can have checks and you can have other regulations and you can reduce the disease risk from that point of view? So indisputably, we need to do a lot more, but we need to think of the very specific ways of dealing with this. And almost certainly we want to identify where the real risks are and then have different solutions for different problems. It's a lot more complicated than just something like banning or increasing education. And now it's my turn to ask a question. This is for David, and it's a question from Heroes. He says, is there sufficient surveillance of legitimate animal and plant imports to have confidence that any dangerous pest and pathogens they host will be identified? Over to you, David.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Hugh. The short answer is no, there can never be sufficient surveillance to detect every pest and pathogen entering the UK. And I think the big challenge here is that we need to balance surveillance and biosecurity with minimising any harmful impacts on the trade of goods, unless there's really, really compelling reasons why a particular trade pathway really needs to be constrained. And even then, it can be rather difficult to stop that trade. And a really good example of this was the UK's attempt this year to prevent the introduction of a bacterial disease called Xylella in plants that were being imported from mainland Europe. And this pest is killing oak, sycamore and many commercial plants in Europe. And it's something which we really don't want in the UK. And so the UK plant regulations were put in force to try and prevent the import of high-risk plants that we knew were carrying Xylella, unless those plants have been through really stringent requirements of regulation. But the European Commission rejected as disproportionate the UK's proposals. And as a result, all we can do is inspect every plant coming into the UK. And the problem here is that many may carry diseases but be asymptomatic, so we never really know if it's coming here with those with Xylella or other diseases. And we actually have additional challenges for effective surveillance coming. Since the United Kingdom joined the European Economic Community in 1973, we've seen that much of our trade is coming from mainland Europe. And this has also resulted in most of our pests being present on mainland Europe first. And that's provided us with a really helpful early warning of what might come next into the UK and what problems it might cause. Now, under Brexit, our trade patterns may well change, and that might result in us bringing more goods from places like the Americas and Asia. And this may well bring in new pests that haven't previously been experienced in Europe. And so as a result, we won't have the privilege of the early warnings that we currently have. We won't know what we're supposed to be looking for even. And we might actually start to become the donor rather than the recipient of high impact pests, which we then pass on to our European neighbours. But actually, I think this is more of a question for a politician than a scientist. So maybe I should pass this on to Des.
Well, thanks very much, David. That's what we call a hospital pass. So, actually, I mean, my awareness of just how much we have been dependent on this European Union pathway of warning and the degree to which we've been dependent on cooperation in that larger scale in order to control these pests and other problems has increased significantly since I've been involved with these guys. I have to say, though, mind you, that the Xylella problem has been made worse for us because of the EU's unwillingness to engage with us on it. But in many cases, we have a synergy or a dependence on them for our biosecurity in this field. So the challenge is not that we're not aware of this, because I've been helped to ask lots of questions in Parliament about this, and it's perfectly clear that the minister that I'm dealing with in the Lords gets it. He knows it and understands it, and by and large the DEFRA ministers know it and understand it. But there are lots of things about Brexit that we get, but that we're not going to be ready for. And I think this is one of them. I watch down the corridor from where I normally practice my political arts to the House of Commons, who are very slowly going through an enormous piece of legislation called the Environment Bill that lays the basic kind of legal changes for this post-Brexit world. Well, they've only just gone back into committee recently, and those of you who understand how Parliament deals with legislation know that that's like one step out of about seven that a piece of legislation has to go through. And that's not the answer, as both Bill and David know really well, and David works with quite a lot. You can change the law, you can even change the regulations, but then you have to put the fundamentals in place to apply this on the ground, and they need to be changed. And in this case, what we need to do is we need to replace European Union administrations or regulatory bodies that we've been depending on with our own regulatory bodies, and they have to be created. And that means, training people at that kind of in that area to be able to do this. And it just looks to me as though we are not going to be ready. Any more than we are going to be ready, it would appear, to accommodate lorries crossing the English Channel. So we're kind of like behind the game in that, because it's taken so long to get us to where we want to be. So I'm afraid I haven't got anything positive to say about that, but we will get there, because Brexit's a reality we're going to have to go on with it. We may be late, but the damage could be done by the time we catch up on the legal side of it. So we've come to the end of the 30 minutes that we gave ourselves. It was clearly inadequate. And in opening, I promised you more. And we have other BioRISC colleagues who are working on other interesting projects, and we would be more than happy, I say, to the comms team in St. Catz to arrange another Catz chat with them, talking about their projects. They're very interesting things there. More broadly, I would like to see the development of the UK version of the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences, Science and Technology Fellowship Programme that gives opportunities to outstanding scientists and engineers to serve year-long fellowship assignments in the public policy environment in Parliament, You know, even in the Supreme Court, judicial branches of government, you know, perhaps in government departments, and I'm working with others here in the hope that we can maybe get into that environment. Okay, so the best way for experts from both sides, as I keep saying, in the policy and science and technology equation to get things right is to spend more time with each other. So in closing, thank you all very much for tuning in. Let me remind you that the next Catz chat will focus on welfare at St Catherine's, which is in the forefront of everybody's consideration at the moment. So don't forget to log in then. Thanks again. Keep safe. Bye.